Good evening. Today we're continuing our studies in 1 Samuel, the life of David. So if you have time, if you would like to read 1 Samuel 22 before we have a look at that study and then come back and listen or look through the passage as we look at it. So 1 Samuel chapter 22. Now you'll remember that on the last occasion we looked at the previous chapter. David had been on the run. He'd been on the run for quite a while, and he was running from Saul. He came to the priest Nob, Ahimelech, and asked for the bread, and he also took Goliath's sword with him from Nob. And then he ran to Gath, and he came to the king of Gath, and the people in Gath recognized him. They recognized his identity. And then he started to pretend to be a madman, started scratching at the doors, acting completely insane. And the king says, "Why did you bring this crazy man to me? Surely I've got enough madmen here already. Get him out of here." So David escapes once again. David is once again on the run. And in chapter 22, it begins with those words, therefore. So we're looking back at the events at the end of chapter 21. Therefore. And at the beginning of chapter 22, David is waiting and David is watching. David has escaped from Gath and he now finds a cave to wait in for a while. And he comes to the place which is called Cave Adullam, which means a place of justice or refuge of the people. And there he is, firstly alone in the darkness. He's been on the run for several years. It's been calculated that David was probably on the run for a good part of 10 years. And those 10 years come some 25 years after Samuel first came to him as son of Jesse and anointed him as king. And as he comes to Adullam, this is what F.B. Mayer says in his book. 2 miles up the valley of Elah from Gath is a labyrinth of hills and valleys, deeply honeycombed with caves. One of these near the ancient Canaanite city of Adullam, and called after it, afforded David, for a considerable period, the shelter of which he was in search. It is described as a dark vault, the entrance of which is a low window in the perpendicular face of the cliff, and its position made it possible for him to cross from one country to another as occasion required. So David is there in this cave. And we read Psalm 142. Psalm 142 quite clearly is written. The description above Psalm 142 is a contemplation of David, a prayer when he was in the cave. At this point in his life, in the cave of Adullam. And then David has care for his family. It seems that Saul knew where David's parents were, and so David wants to take care of his family. He doesn't want them to be in the reach of Saul. So we read in chapter 22 that David departed from there, escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. But that was not the best place for his family to be in. Look again at Psalm 142 and verse 7. Psalm 142 and verse 7. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise you. The righteous shall surround me, for you shall deal bountifully with me. Here in the cave, this is becoming true because David's parents, David's family, are surrounding him. And then we need even more in verse 2 about those who were there. Verse 2, Everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. So going from one man, David, to his family, now this crowd in the cave of Adullam has grown to some 400 plus people. It's not easy to keep 400 people quiet, or the knowledge that there are 400 people living in a cave. The end of verse 2. So David became captain over them. These people were flocking to David, but he becomes their leader. They look to him for guidance. There are qualities of leadership which are being shown in David's life. God is preparing him as captain, as we have in this translation, or leader, and they're looking to David for leadership. David has been brought low, and you may remember that we made the point last time that, as in the chapter 21, David doesn't make any mention at all of God. It's all his own way. But verses 3 to 4 of that psalm, when my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then you knew my path, the way in which I walk. They have secretly set a snare for me. Look on my right hand and see, for there's no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul. This is how David saw himself when he came to the cave of Adullam. Now, David could have rejected God's promises, but David comes to God. He acknowledges who God is. He must have acknowledged also his guilt, and the Lord speaks to him. He has that confidence returning to him. Verse 5. Firstly, he has to cry to the Lord. Verse 5. I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. David believes. David believes in supplication. Verse 1. I cried out to the Lord with my voice. With my voice to the Lord I made supplication. He's repeating himself there. I cry out with my voice, and it's with my voice I make supplication. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare before him my trouble. There's an emphasis there in this psalm of crying out to the Lord, crying out in supplication. Verse 4. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul. He cries out to the Lord. I said, you are my refuge. He's in God's provision. And as the Lord looks down on him, David receives God's provision. Yes, he's got those 400 men in the cave, but God is dealing with David himself. And we see David now looks for a safe place for his parents. Verse 3. David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, please let my father and mother come here with you, till I know what God will do for me. He goes to the king, he pleads for help in another country. And David here shows the hope that he has in God, in that cave. Look at those words there at the end of verse 3. Till I know what God will do for me. He holds on to hope. It's given to David that God will accomplish what is promised. He's promised he will become king. Is God going to let him down? All he has to do is to wait, to see how God is going to work. He says there, till I know what God will do for me. We've seen time and time again in this study in David's belief in the sovereignty in the providential care of the Lord. So he cries to the Lord, and the Lord answers him. Psalm 57 is also written at the time of Cave Adullam, and it's a very similar Psalm 242. And how often we need to stand still. We need to stand still, as it were, in the cave entrance and wait and look for what God is going to do for us. God has plans for us. We read in Jeremiah 29, I think it is. I have plans for you, not plans to harm you, but plans to prosper you. David is to wait. Wait with expectancy. God will come. He will not delay. David is to look and see what God is doing. Just like Habakkuk. As Habakkuk there was standing, we read in the watchtower in Habakkuk chapter 2. He says, I will stand, I will watch, I will wait. Habakkuk chapter 2, the beginning of that chapter. I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart to watch and see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected. He has to wait. Carrying on in that chapter in Habakkuk, verse 2 to 3, the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time. At the end it will speak. It will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. So David had to wait. But then it was time for David to act in verse 5. And verse 5 tells us about this prophet called Gad, an unknown prophet. We don't have any mention, as far as I'm aware, of this man Gad anywhere else. But Gad is the mouthpiece that God uses. Verse 5, the prophet Gad said to David, do not stay in the stronghold, depart and go to the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Herath. 400 people in the cave. They won't keep quiet. David has to move away. God is telling him to move away through this prophet Gad. David is looking to God for the answer. What do we read there in verse 3? Till I know what God will do for me. And now Gad comes along and Gad gives him the answer, what he is to do. He is to go to Judea. He is to go and wait in the forest of Herath. The prophet brings the answer to David's cry. So David acts, but then Saul acts. And we've seen time and time again Saul's hatred, Saul's jealousy, and that is increasing the more so in this chapter. Verse 6, when Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, now Saul was staying in Gilboa under the tamarisk tree at Ramah, with his spear in his hand and all his servants standing around him. His jealousy is getting worse. The fact he's standing there ready with his spear now. And then we have these next few verses where it's to Saul, it's clear that there were those who were conspiring against him. Saul said to his servants who stood by him, hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse, David, give you every one your fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there is no one of you who is sorry for me, who reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as it is this day. So Saul is now blaming everyone else for conspiring against him. And then In verse 9, we have this man Doeg. Now, you remember last time we saw in chapter 21 how, in the middle of the narrative of the incident at Nob, Doeg's name is dropped into the narrative. Verse 7:21. Now, a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day when David was asking for the bread. His name was Doeg, an Ebenite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. And it's Doeg who comes forward, who tells Saul what happened. I saw the son of Jesse, verse 9, going to Nob and to Ahimelech, the son of Abitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him. He gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So there is that witness there, the man Doeg. Now, Calvin calls Doeg a consummate villain. And now Ahimelech, the priest, and his family are called before Saul in verse 11. And he is asked what has happened. And he too is now accused of conspiring against Saul. Verse 13. Then Saul said to him, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse? Isn't that called David? It's called the son of Jesse. The son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day. It's the same accusation that we read earlier on in the chapter. So Ahimelech has to answer this accusation in verse 14. Who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, who goes at your bidding and is honourable in your house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant, nor anything to the house of my father. For your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much, was what Ahimelech tells him. And now Saul's jealousy is such that he orders that Ahimelech and the 85 priests from Nob are to be killed. But at the end of verse 17, he's commanded those there to kill him. But verse 17, the servants of the king would not lift up their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. They would not kill those priests from Nob. Why is that? Well, earlier on we saw in the passage that the parish servants held David in a very high view. They respected David. That could be one reason. And also the fact that we are told here that clearly the description is given that they are priests of the Lord. So would they therefore refuse to kill those who were priests? So once again, Doeg, the consummate villain, as Calvin calls him, now steps forward and kills these 85 priests. But the slaughter doesn't end there, because in Nob, where the priests were, those who were living in Nob are also attacked. Verse 19. Also Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys, and sheep, with the edge of the sword. Then we have, in the last 3 verses, a mention of one of the sons of Ahimelech, Abithar. We're going to look at that particularly next time. So this passage before us, what can we learn from this passage? Again, we see in it how Saul is sinking even lower into his sin. David, as I've mentioned, in contrast to the last chapter, when there was no mention when he was at Gath, feigning to be that madman, or when he was at Nob with the priests, there's no mention there of David's trust in God. But this passage here, clearly he has returned to the Lord. He's looking to the Lord. And what a change there is in that man who ran from Nob to Gath. David now is once again seen as a man of trust and of faith. Seen in the way he's concerned for his parents in sending them to Moab, and his trust in God's sovereign purposes. So David is beginning to develop as a leader of men. He's being prepared for the kingship. As we saw there, how he was referred to as the captain of those 400 men who were there in the cave of Adullam. And this doesn't happen overnight. It is God's timing. It's been said, hard times make God's people strong. Times when the props, often that we rely on, are removed. Times that we are to trust in God, to trust in Him at all times. Just go back to that Psalm 142. I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Attend to my cry, for I was brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are stronger than I. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise your name. The righteous shall surround me, for you shall deal bountifully with